timer's off.
Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. I'm Chuck Mason, and with me today is Janelle Blue. Janelle is the president of our sponsor, the Mount Vernon Genealogical Society, and we're back after 5 months and in the new world. So today we're going to talk about something that a lot of people have problems with. We're going to talk about vital records. And one of the things that I find is people don't understand how vital records were kept, where they were kept, and so they're often not sure how to go about finding them. And when I say they don't understand about them, a number of years ago, I was leading a trip to Pennsylvania, to Harrisburg, to the state archives, and I had somebody sign up for the trip, and we had a couple of meetings beforehand for the Mid-Atlantic group at Fairfax. And so I had this man sign up, and he said, "I'm so excited. I can't wait to go on this trip." He said, "I desperately need birth certificates for my ancestors." And I thought, okay, where and when? And I asked him, and I said, where and when, and he gave me the counties and he gave me the dates in the 1700s, and I had to inform him that vital records do not begin in Pennsylvania until 1906 continuously. And so to clarify that is, states may have had vital records laws, then they may have rescinded them. So you may have records for periods of time, but continuously means they start on a specific date, and from that day forward, they kept vital records. So Pennsylvania, it's 1906. So
people get really confused about where who initiates the vital records and where they're kept. And if you're new to the genealogy and you think, well, you're here in Washington, D.C., so the National Archives is right here, you should be able to get anything. Has the federal government ever issued vital records?
No, with one exception. If you have people who are born overseas, so sometimes in the military, I have friends that they were both in the Air Force, both stationed in England, and both their sons were born. So they had birth certificates issued by England, but they also had the births registered at the American Embassy, and so the embassy issued a birth certificate. Now, that could also happen with civilians. You could have a woman give birth in a foreign country and the birth be registered in the embassy or the consulate. But other than that, no, the federal government does not issue birth certificates, death certificates, or marriage certificates.
So who is responsible for issuing?
It is each of the states. They are charged with setting all the requirements, what is required on the certificate, the procedure for registering and recording births, deaths, marriages, and what is on the certificate. When you get into getting copies of them, they determine whether they are restricted for periods of time, what the fee is to get a vital record of some sort. And so that's why across the country you have this real great differences in some cases of what you can get, when you can get it, and how much it's going to cost you, and what it's going to include.
And some of the states didn't all start at the same time, did they?
No. Of the original 13 colonies, with the exception of marriage records, which we're going to talk about in another show, only 7 of those original colonies kept vital records continually before 1900. For the most part, it's after 1900 in most of the country before you begin to get vital records being kept continually.
And so where within the state then would you go to find those?
Well, what I tell people to do within state is, number one, guides to research in various states. For example, the National Genealogical Society has a set of research guides. Now, they don't have them for all 50 states. I think they have somewhere around 28 or 30 of them. They're working on them,
Right.
but they haven't been able to do that. But that's a good source if there is one. The other place I tell people to go is to go to the State Department of Health or Bureau of Vital Records, depending on what the state calls their Vital Records office. Go to that website, because that usually includes all the information that you need. Tells you when Vital Records began,
Right.
tells you usually if there were Vital Records for periods of time before they began continually, where they're housed, if they're restricted, who is eligible to get them, and what the fee is going to be to order them.
Those guides, like the NGS guides, are the best way then to find that
or
in
the State
websites.
Vital Records Office, because the one thing with the NGS guides, they were done at a particular time, and so some of that information may change. Like, for example, the fee is likely to change. But,
Yes.
so the state would have the most up-to-date. As the legislature passes any changes and they go into effect, they're going to change their website. And, there are lots of other guides out there that have been published over the years, but, the information is going to be current as of when it's published. If it was published 20 years ago, probably half the information for half the states has a change or two.
It's been my observation that if it's before the time when the state was beginning to record births, then the best place to look for is the church. But the
Yes.
state didn't take the church records
No.
and record those later, did they?
No. Churches that particularly did infant baptisms, that's a great place. In fact,
Yeah.
that's what I said to this person that was going to go on this Pennsylvania trip. And they said, well, where am I going to get the information? I said, do you know what their religion was?
Yeah.
If you know their religion and, it's a church that did infant baptisms, then, looking for the
Yeah.
churches and looking for baptisms, or, other things, if there wasn't baptisms, maybe confirmation is going to include a date of birth. So, again, it's kind of before Vital Records, a little tough.
And most of the time, if you see a baptism record, it will have the birth date on it, which is
Yes.
usually different.
Yes.
So you want to be sure and look at the birth date.
Or, you'll have the baptism date, and then, you have a time period. The child's born by that time.
Yeah.
What's the practice
Right.
for baptisms? Is it infant baptisms? And, and then again, it can be off because, the Methodist church that I grew up in does infant baptisms, but I wasn't baptized until my oldest living sister was born. And so she's 6.5 years younger than me, so I was close to 7 years old before I got baptized,
So-
although I could have been baptized as an infant.
And in some of the early churches, and I mean, the early 1900s, they issued like a baptism certificate, and I have
yeah.
one for my parents. And so there's another
Yes.
way that you can at least. They usually have a birth record on there too, as well as
Yeah.
the baptism.
Yeah, usually I find most of them include the date of birth, at least when you get into the 20th century. They usually include the date of birth. And sometimes if you can get back to the original record rather than the certificate.
Yeah.
Sometimes there's things in the remarks column that a lot of the registers have that doesn't always get included on the certificate. I found some helpful information. So, but again, it's being able to get back to those original registers.
Which is not always very easy
not
to
always,
do.
No, no.
Okay, so here's one that having done a lot of research in Texas, we really don't run into this, but I've heard about these notification of birth registrations. Can you talk about that?
Yes, this was something created at the request of many states by the federal government, and we have an example of one there on the screen now. The federal government was the push behind getting states to keep vital records. And when you get into the early 1900s, they were pushing this more and more. And a lot of states did not keep vital records. So at the request of a lot of states, they came up with this registration form. The federal government sent them out to the states, or the states could come up with their own. So if you do an internet search on these, you're going to see the basic format is there, or the basic information is there, but the format is a little different. The font of the type that was used and all. But the idea behind these were to have them filled out with the birth information, and then the state would send it to the parents. If there was incorrect information on it, the parents were to correct it and return it to the state. And then they would take and correct any records, whatever way they were keeping records. They would correct that official record based on the parents' information. And a lot of states use these for a period of time into the 1940s before they finally came up with their own certificates. My spouse, born here in Virginia in 1944, has one of these notifications. And of course, one of the things that throws people off is because it says on the certificate, Department of Commerce, Bureau of, I think it's the Census. And so that causes people to think that it's the federal government issuing this, and the federal government is keeping copies of them. And no, they didn't do that. I believe you know Connie Potter, who used to work at the National Archives. Before they moved all the research down to the first floor, they were up on the fourth floor, and there was a little room off from the research room that there was a staff member sat there and answered questions. People walked in, they were there to answer them, or people would call on the phone. And when Connie would be there, if nobody was there, I'd pop in, we'd chit-chat. And almost every time I was there, if I was there, any length of time, and usually I was with Connie, if you know her, she talks, I like to talk. She would get a call someone wanting their birth certificate from the National Archives, or she'd have people come in looking for their birth certificate.
Oh my gosh.
So it was very confusing to people, to see this, and they automatically, if I didn't know more than I did when I got into genealogy, I probably would have thought, oh, well, the federal government is going to have these.
Well, I mean, most people have no concept of what is there at the archives, and you just think they've got one of everything, and they've got a lot, but not necessarily.
And of course, to probably house all the vital records, that if they had that for all the country, they probably would be out the doors with stuff of the building there, because if you have ever seen the stacks and things, it's amazing, but they're just stuffed full, and that's why periodically they will move things out to College Park, although I understand that's pretty much full.
Yeah,
and so they have to find other places to
and they have the
things.
regional offices too.
Yes, which do have lots of things that they don't have downtown, and downtown has microfilm copies of some of what's out in the regional archives.
So I take it that all birth records don't look alike. All birth certificates don't look alike.
No. Originally, for a lot of states, instead of a certificate as we know it, they recorded things in a register much like a church register, but of course it was customized to what was required to be kept in the register itself. And we have a picture of a register. So it had columns for all of the information. There is one, and this one is actually from Scotland. And I put this in rather than a one from the United States because I have a really good picture, and also it happens to include one of my great-grandfather's older brothers is on that particular register there. So, so you're going to at least get the name of the child, when they were born, whether they were a male or a female, and who the parents were. And in New Jersey, you get the father's occupation. And when I say parents were, that was an interesting situation when I started looking for my third great-grandparents, William and Sarah Mason. They were married in 1845, and vital records begin in New Jersey in 1848. They have the second oldest continual vital records after Massachusetts. And so between censuses and vital records and all, I was trying to compile their children. And what I found was the vital records column for the parents was supposed to include the husband and the wife. Well, they don't always fill out everything they're supposed to. And so what I found in the county, and these were kept for large cities, so they were in Essex County, so the city of Newark were kept separate. My family lived outside of the city, so it was the rest of the county being recorded, and I just went through and I copied down the information for William Mason's, because there was only one William Mason that had a wife listed.
Oh my goodness.
And she was Mary, and my second great-grandmother was Sarah. So what I did with the information, fortunately, I knew that William was a sign and decorative painter, and it listed occupation. And so when I got all the information pulled out to look at and put it into format, I could go down, I could pick out the painters and set them aside and compare those dates of birth with information that I found mainly in the early census records, and I picked out and found their children. But not everyone had an occupation listed, and not everyone had a wife listed for names other than Mason. So for some people it was, or is, going to really be tough to do that.
The occupation thing is something that it was early on, but not necessarily in the modern day stuff. But that is really useful. And if you go back into, for instance, I'm doing German records, that occupation is always listed there, and that's so helpful. The other thing that's listed is the godparents.
Yes.
And I've been able to connect a name because the godparent, I recognize that as being the sister, of the father, and so that validated a couple of questions that I had.
You get that in church records with the birth records. You really don't. And New Jersey, basically, they begin the 1st of May, 1848, and they continue until 1878 in the register format.
Okay.
And then, once they move to a certificate, you're basically going to get the basic information that was in the register on a certificate. And then, as time progressed, they started adding more information into the records. So, and again, this is something, to point out that different states require different things on their vital records. So you may have one state where you get a lot more information. You may get the time of birth, you may get the weight of the child, the measurements, how long they were, and things like that on one birth certificate for one state, and you're not going to get that for another. And of course, when you get into this, a lot of it depends on who was really charged with registering the information.
I was going to ask you, who actually gives the information to?
Most places, most states, it is either the doctor or the midwife. Because a lot of children, well into the 1900s, were born at home. My father and my mother and all of their siblings were all born at home.
Really?
Yeah. They were all, my mother's youngest brother was born in 1933, and my father's youngest sister was born in 1931.
Depression
they were at home,
times, yeah.
And yes, there was a doctor that came out with my father's family, but it was actually a midwife that was there to assist my mother's mother with the births. And of course, it is the responsibility of the doctor or the midwife to report the information. You do find in some states it's a requirement that the parents make sure it gets reported. And then they have the responsibility. So, again, if the doctor or someone is not doing their job, then you might have a problem.
Well, and that helps to explain why the state might then send that information back to the parent to validate all of the information if it was maybe filled in by the midwife or the attending doctor.
Yeah, and the one thing, not everybody was diligent in doing this. The information may or may not be 100% correct, and oftentimes we don't have a clue, unless we find something that differs elsewhere, and so then we have to. But if the person responsible does not do their job, then you have the problem that we have in both sides of my family. You end up with delayed birth certificates. My mother had a brother 2 years older than her, and my father had a brother 3 years older than him. And when those older siblings went to the county courthouse to get a copy of their birth certificates so they could register for working papers, so they could go off to work, there was nothing at the courthouse, and there was also nothing in Trenton. So then they had to get delayed birth certificates. And so in each case, my grandmothers had to go in. They had to give an affidavit. They took an older sibling that was, 12, 14 years older. My father's mother had a baptismal certificate, and that information was then recorded. But what had evidently happened in the county was the births were registered. They knew that. But evidently the clerk in the courthouse didn't send the information for at least a period of 5 years, because there are lots of births between 1925 and 1930 time frame that are delayed birth certificates. So actually, if they'll put it up, we have a copy of my father's delayed birth certificate that we can show. But nope, it's the fourth one down. It's the black certificate on, there it is. So on the left is actually the way the certificates were issued in New Jersey back in the 1940s when this was done. It looks like a negative. And when my father died and I needed some other vital records, I got good copies, or copies they issue now, of both my mother and my father's certificates. So you have that difference. And, again, it's something that you may run into. When you go to order these, if you know the information, I would recommend that you let the state know that they are, because when I ordered these, I had actually gone to the Vital Records office to drop the applications off, and I didn't think about it till I was walking away, and then I said to the clerk, who was in a plastic bulletproof, I guess, little cubicle, oh, by the way, these are delayed birth certificates, if that makes a difference. And she said, I'm glad you said that. She didn't elaborate. So I assume that they are kept separately. The other thing that you might find is that people make corrections to certificates, because oftentimes, in New Jersey at least, earlier, children were only listed as male or female. And you find later corrections to either correct incorrect information or add their names. So hopefully we've enlightened people a little bit about vital records and in general and births. And we're going to do another show a little later on the rest of vital records.
Well, thank you, Chuck. This has been really interesting, and I've learned some things.
Well, good. I even picked up some things as I was researching for this lecture that I did.
And I just want to remind everybody that Mount Vernon Genealogical Society is in the Holland Hall Center. That's 1500 Shenandoah Road. We're not open right now, but we are doing our meetings on Zoom. So that's mvgenealogy.org. You are all welcome to attend those, and we look forward to the day when we can see you in person. So thank you.
You're welcome.
I always thought it was Social Security, that was the reason why people had to do the delayed birth.
That really Social Security that was the big push.
Yeah.
When I go through vital records in New Jersey on the microfilms, you see a lot of these delayed certificates being issued